Alright, so quick review of where we left off yesterday. We said that these hunters and gatherers, they eventually learned that due to the flooding next to the rivers, that flooding brought with it a whole bunch of fertile soil each year. Now, if you remember from yesterday, we said that this part of the world where the Fertile Crescent was located didn't get a whole lot of rain. It was somewhere between 3 and 6 inches for the year, which, in a good spring, we can maybe get that much in a month. So it doesn't really rain a whole lot there. So the soil and stuff that was there wasn't the best. It was very sandy, very rocky. But these groups of people noticed that next to the river, the soil was very good, and a lot of things grew. So this happened at different times during the year. They had what was called a flood season. They had different names for it, but on the chart here you can see the different months, how they correspond with ours. So from mid-June to mid-October, that river valley is flooded, meaning that the areas next to the river is underwater, no planting is taking place. That is when that fresh, fertile soil is being brought to the area. From mid-October to mid-February, that floodwater starts to go down, and it's depositing that good, fertile soil on top. From mid-February to mid-June, that is your planting season. Okay, that's when you're going to start planting your crops and things in that soil, and you're going to be harvesting them, toward the middle of June before the next flood arrives. So here's a satellite view of Nile River. You can kind of see how it looks like it's green. That's not the actual water itself. That is the land on either side of the river. This kind of shows you a better picture of it, where you can almost see exactly where that flood water comes each year. Where the green is where that flood water is going to come up to. It's going to deposit that rich, fertile soil. That's where they're going to be able to actually plant their crops. So the people who are going to live here, if you're going to build a house or put a house here somewhere, do you want to put it here in the green? Probably not, because what's going to happen mid-June? Yeah, your house is going to be underwater. So you would build out here a little bit past that floodplain. Then you still have access to that good soil to plant your crops and the fresh water. So yeah, you would plant your crops in this green area, and then by the time the next flood arrived, you'd want to have your crops harvested so that they didn't get ruined. A lot of people think that this flooding is what waters their crops. No, the crops are already out of the ground before that happens. It's kind of like farmers around here with their corn. All right, if you drive past a cornfield here, most farmers around our area already have their corn harvested. If they don't, it's no good. So this picture, this is taken during that flood season. You can kind of see the water's kind of shallow, but you can still see kind of the little plots where they have that planted once the floodwaters go down. Yeah, so this picture shows a pretty good job. You can kind of see this little ledge or this little shelf over there on the right. Okay, so this is kind of up higher from the river. It floods in this lower section, and then people have built their houses up on this little plain. So they still have pretty easy access down here to their fields. Their homes are built up and out of that floodplain, but it's pretty easy for them to get to their crops and to their water source. Now, once the floodwaters had gone down and people were planting their crops in that good fertile soil that was left behind, remember, we still have a problem. There's no rain, or very, very little rain. So we still got to get those crops watered. Okay, just because they're close to the river doesn't mean that they're just going to magically get watered. So they had to come up with a system for what we call irrigation. Irrigation is simply bringing water to dry land. The way that they did this wasn't really anything too fancy. Usually it was small trenches that were cut along the riverbank and into their fields. So they would literally just cut a small trench that went the same way as the river current, and the river current would push that water into the trench, and that trench would then go out through their field. Okay, that water, as it went through that trench, could be absorbed into the soil, or they could manually go through the trench and water their crops that way. Okay, so you can kind of see the river in the background there and how it's kind of cut at an angle. Okay, so if the water current's going this way, it's pushing some of that water through the trench and in through the field. You can kind of see this picture here where they've got some smaller trenches off to the side of it for some of that water to soak down into. But it was just a way to be able to water those crops during those dry months when they weren't going to get any rain and the floodwaters were gone. Now, another type of irrigation they would do. This is a computer drawing of a guy using the tool's called a shadoof. It's a kind of a weighted bucket, pretty much. There's a counterweight here in the back. It was usually some type of an animal skin bag that was filled with rocks or dirt. And they'd have a bucket attached to the other end. You could use your body weight to drop the bucket down into the water. The counterweight on the back would make it a lot easier to lift the bucket up out of the water once it was full. And then there's usually a trench behind this where the guy could just literally take the bucket, dump it in that trench, and it would flow down through the field. Now, some places in these desert regions, you can still find these. Some primitive farmers still, or some rural farmers still use this shadoof to irrigate their fields. Not many, but a few do. Now, we talked yesterday a little bit about how these three rivers are going to be super important to the groups of people that settled in this area. One of the big things is trade. Once people stop being hunters and gatherers and settling in an area, they can kind of focus their time on other things. If you no longer have to spend all day hunting and looking for food because you're planting it, or raising animals on your own to eat, you can start working on other stuff. You can start using some of that extra time to build things and make things, discover new things. So people would often trade this kind of stuff. It could be anything from pottery to clothing, tools, weapons, and the rivers that were around them and the seas that were around them made it a lot easier for people to trade with other groups of people. Those rivers and those seas made it so that you could get places faster, you can get there easier, and you can get to more places. If you have to walk to go everywhere you're going, okay, the distance that you travel is pretty limited based on how far you want to walk or how much energy you have. If you can put a raft on a river and let the current take you, odds are you're going to go to more places. So being next to those rivers and next to those seas helped kind of connect people even more. But in addition to kind of helping trade, there's a bunch of other ways that being next to these bodies of water helped connect these groups of people or helped benefit these groups of people. So for number 8, you've got a list of 7 things here. Memorize this list because we will use it again. And I'll explain that here once you finish writing it down. Now the reason why I said these were important and remember them is because we'll talk about these at least 3 more times this year. Like I told you the other day, the groups of people that we talk about in social studies this year, they're groups of people that settled next to rivers. So it doesn't matter what civilization we're talking about or what group of people we're talking about, they're all going to use those rivers in the same way. They're all going to have the same benefits of living next to a river. So obvious answer number 1 is it's a water source. It's fresh water. You never have to go searching for water. It's always right there next to you. Number 2 is your food source. You can fish from it. You can hunt the animals that come to the river to drink. Trade and transportation we just covered. You can get to more places and you can trade with other groups of people. Number 5, mud bricks. We'll talk about mud bricks a little bit later on, but they were able to use the mud from the riverbanks to make the first style of bricks to build homes. They could also use that mud to make the first forms of pottery. And then lastly is irrigation. You can use that fresh water to water your crops. So, like I said, any civilization that we talk about that settled next to a river is going to use it for these 7 things. Now, something I will tell you, a lot of people will always try to add like bathing to this list. Ancient civilizations, guys, they weren't really into bathing. It wasn't a thing. Okay, so never write down bathing because it just wasn't something that they really did very often. As gross as that sounds, everyone would have smelled the same, so it wouldn't have been a big deal. So yeah, it just wasn't something that they really did back then. And it wasn't like they had soap and shampoo and all that stuff to even make them smell better anyway. So a lot of people always think, oh, they used it for bathing. No, not really. Yeah, that's probably a good place for us to stop today.